The October wind carried the scent of snow down from the Medicine Bow Mountains as Elise Hoffman knelt beside her husband's grave. 6 months had passed since consumption claimed Anton, yet the German words of farewell still caught in her throat like barbed wire. "Mein Liebster Anton." She whispered, her calloused fingers tracing the rough-hewn cross. "They think I will give up the claim. They do not know German stubbornness." The Hoffman homestead stretched across a bend of Bitter Creek, where the water ran clear and cold, fed by mountain springs that had carved this valley long before white men drew lines on territorial maps. Anton had chosen this spot carefully, an engineer's eye for good water and defensible ground. Now the Consolidated Mining Syndicate wanted both. Elise rose, brushing prairie dust from her woolen skirt. At 30, she possessed the kind of beauty that frontier hardship had refined rather than destroyed. High cheekbones, inherited from Bavarian ancestors, steel blue eyes that missed nothing, and hands strong enough to work a 40-acre claim alone. Her wheat-colored hair, pinned severely beneath a black mourning bonnet, caught the autumn light like spun gold. The sound of approaching horses made her turn toward the creek trail. 3 riders emerged from the cottonwoods: Silas Crenshaw and 2 of his hired men. The mine supervisor sat his horse with the casual arrogance of a man accustomed to getting his way through intimidation or coin, whichever proved more expedient. "Mrs. Hoffman." Crenshaw touched his hat brim in a mockery of courtesy. "Lovely morning for paying respects." "Herr Crenshaw." She kept her voice level, though her hand drifted to the Navy Colt at her hip. Anton had taught her to shoot, and 6 months of defending the homestead alone had taught her when shooting might be necessary. "I've come with another offer." Crenshaw produced a folded paper from his coat. $200 for your claim. That's more than generous for a woman in your circumstances. Elise didn't reach for the paper. "My circumstances include legal ownership of this land, clean water rights under territorial law, and a loaded Spencer rifle in my cabin. Which circumstance concerns you most?" One of Crenshaw's men, a scarred brute named Kowalski, shifted in his saddle. "Uppity for a widow woman." "A Kowalski?" Crenshaw's tone carried warning. "The lady and I are conducting business." "The lady is done conducting business with you," Elise said. This land was legally homesteaded. The water rights are recorded in Laramie. Find another source for your mining operations. Crenshaw's smile never reached his eyes. "Mrs. Hoffman, you strike me as an intelligent woman. Too intelligent to believe that legal papers protect you from accidents. Claim jumpers are common in these parts. Fires happen. Sometimes a woman alone simply disappears." The threat hung in the air like gunpowder smoke. Elise felt the familiar cold anger that had sustained her through Anton's dying and the lonely months since. "Are you threatening me, Herr Crenshaw?" "I'm offering you a way to avoid tragedy." He let the paper flutter to the ground. "Think it over. My patience has limits." The 3 riders departed, leaving Elise alone with the whisper of wind through buffalo grass. She picked up the spurned offer and let it burn in the fire ring where she'd cooked breakfast. The ashes scattered on the breeze like her last illusions about civilization reaching Wyoming territory. That evening, as purple shadows filled the valley, Elise sat on her cabin porch cleaning the Spencer rifle. Anton's engineering notebook lay open beside her, filled with precise drawings and calculations. Water flow rates, mineral surveys, and something else, notes about Consolidated's operations that had worried him in his final weeks. The creek gurgled past her cabin 30 yards away through the cottonwoods. Good water, Anton had always said. The kind men would kill for. A movement across the creek caught her eye. A figure emerged from the timber, tall, lean, moving with the fluid silence of a natural predator. Lakota by his dress and bearing. He paused at the water's edge, studying her homestead with dark eyes that seemed to catalog every detail. Elise raised the Spencer, but didn't aim it directly. "This is private land. State your business." The man stepped into the moonlight. He was perhaps 35, with the weathered features of someone who lived by his wits in hard country. His black hair fell to his shoulders, bound with a strip of rawhide. Traditional buckskin clothing marked him as one who still followed the old ways, despite the reservations and government treaties. "I am Tokala," he said in clear English. "Tokala, whispering fox. I come with words about the men who poison water." Elise kept the rifle ready. "What men?" "The miners who steal from the creek above your land, who kill fish and make the water run yellow with their greed." His voice carried the cadence of someone translating thoughts from another language. "My people drink from this stream. What they do upstream makes children sick." The Consolidated Mine. Tokala nodded. "They dig deep, pump water from the earth, let poison flow back into the creek." He gestured toward the mountains. "I have watched. I have seen." Despite her wariness, Elise found herself believing him. Anton's notes had mentioned irregularities in water flow changes in the creek's color after heavy rains. "Why tell me this?" "Because you fight them. Because the water runs past your land to my people. Because sometimes enemies of enemies must speak truth to each other." The logic was frontier simple and frontier brutal. Elise lowered the rifle slightly. "What kind of poison?" "The kind that comes from crushing rock to find gold. The kind that seeps from their waste piles when it rains." Tokala's expression remained neutral, but his hands spoke in small gestures that suggested controlled anger. They care nothing for what lives downstream. "Have you complained to the territorial authorities?" Something that might have been bitter amusement flickered across Tokala's features. "White man's law protects white man's profits. My people learned this at Wounded Knee, at the Washita, at Sand Creek." The names hung between them like epitaphs. Elise had heard the stories, though details varied depending on who told them. What mattered was the truth behind Tokala's words in Wyoming. Territory justice flowed toward money and power, not toward those who lacked both. "What do you propose?" she asked. "Information. I show you what they do upstream. You use white man's law to stop it." He paused, studying her face in the moonlight. "If white man's law fails, we find other ways." The suggestion carried implications that made Elise's German practicality war with her widow's desperation. She needed allies, but allying with a Lakota warrior against white businessmen could brand her as an enemy of her own people. On the other hand, Crenshaw's threats had already marked her as expendable. "I'll need proof," she said finally. "Evidence that will convince a territorial judge." Evidence exists. The question is whether you have courage to gather it. Herr Fox, I buried my husband 6 months ago and have been fighting claim jumpers, water thieves, and mining syndicates ever since. My courage is not in question. For the first time, Tokala's expression showed something like approval. "Good. Meet me at the old trapper's cabin upstream tomorrow, when the sun reaches its highest point. Come alone. Bring writing materials to record what you see." He melted back into the shadows with the same fluid silence that had brought him to her creek. Elise sat for a long time afterward, listening to the water flow past her land and thinking about Anton's notebook, about Crenshaw's threats, and about the strange alliance she was contemplating. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of snow and the distant howl of wolves. Winter was coming to Wyoming territory, and Elise Hoffman meant to be ready for it. The trapper's cabin squatted in a grove of aspens 3 miles upstream from Elise's homestead, its log walls chinked with moss and mud against the coming winter. She arrived at midday to find Tokala already waiting, crouched beside the ruins of an old fireplace with the patience of a man accustomed to long watches. "You came," he said without surprise. "I said I would." Elise dismounted and tied her mare to a deadfall pine. She carried Anton's surveying equipment in a canvas satchel compass, measuring chain and notebook for recording observations. "Show me what Consolidated is doing to the water." Tokala led her through dense timber toward the sound of machinery. The noise grew louder as they climbed the rhythmic thump of steam pumps, the clatter of ore carts, and the shouted orders of working men. They emerged on a ridge overlooking the Consolidated mine, and Elise felt her breath catch. The operation sprawled across a natural basin like a wound in the earth. Hydraulic monitors shot pressurized water at gravel banks, washing gold-bearing ore into sluices, while stripping away topsoil that had taken centuries to accumulate. Steam-powered pumps worked constantly to dewater the diggings, sending torrents of muddy discharge downhill toward Bitter Creek. But it was the waste dumps that made Elise's German engineering mind recoil. Tons of crushed rock gray-black with chemical residue stretched in loose piles along the creek bank. Recent rains had carved gullies through the dumps, sending contaminated runoff directly into the stream. "My God," she whispered, then caught herself. "My God, how long has this been going on?" "Since spring. They dig deeper each month, pump more water, crush more rock." Tokala pointed to a series of wooden flumes that channeled water from the creek to power the hydraulic monitors. "They take clean water from above, return poison water below." Elise opened Anton's notebook and began sketching the layout, noting distances and elevations with professional precision. Her husband had taught her to think like an engineer, to see how water flowed, how pressure built, how poorly designed systems would inevitably fail. "The waste rock," she said, still writing. "What minerals are they extracting?" "Gold, mostly. But the rock holds other metals. Copper, lead, things that poison water when exposed to air and rain." Elise nodded grimly. Acid mine drainage, she'd read about it in technical journals. When sulfide minerals oxidized, they created sulfuric acid that leached heavy metals from surrounding rock. The process could contaminate water for decades. A shout from below made them duck behind a fallen log. 2 riders approached the mine office, Silas Crenshaw, and another man Elise didn't recognize. The stranger was well-dressed in city clothes, his horse and tack expensive enough to suggest money and authority. "That is Henrik Miller," Tokala said quietly. "He owns the mine through intermediaries. Comes here sometimes to check operations." Henrik Muller. Elise had heard the name in Laramie, German immigrant who'd made a fortune in Colorado mining before expanding into Wyoming territory. The irony of a fellow German threatening her homestead wasn't lost on her. "How do you know so much about Consolidated's ownership?" she asked. Tokala's smile held no warmth. "I make it my business to know my enemies. Muller thinks he owns this valley because he has papers from the territorial government. My people have been here for generations. Paper does not change the truth of the land." They watched Crenshaw and Muller inspect the mining operation. Even from a distance, Elise could see the easy familiarity between them, on the relationship of men who shared profitable secrets. Muller pointed toward the waste dumps, then gestured downstream in the direction of her homestead. "They're planning something," she murmured. "They plan to take your water rights by force if you won't sell. With your land, they can expand operations and dump waste without interference." The calculation was brutally simple. Elise's homestead controlled the choke point where Bitter Creek narrowed between rocky bluffs. Whoever owned that land controlled downstream water flow and could hide what happened upstream. "We need to document the water contamination," she said. "Take samples, measure flow rates, gather evidence that will stand up in territorial court." White man's courts serve white man's interests. Mueller has money to buy judges and politicians. Maybe. But I have to try legal means first. Elise closed the notebook and met Tokala's dark gaze. Anton always said that engineering problems have engineering solutions. If we can prove Consolidated is violating riparian water rights and creating a public nuisance, we can force them to stop or at least change their methods. And if the courts refuse to act, the question hung between them like a challenge. Elise thought of Crenshaw's threats of the contaminated water flowing past her homestead toward Lakota families downstream. Sometimes the law wasn't enough. Sometimes frontier justice was the only justice available. "Then we find other ways," she said. 3 weeks of careful surveillance provided Elise with a damning portfolio of evidence against Consolidated mining. Working with Tokala, she documented water contamination levels, photographed the waste dumps using Anton's camera equipment, and recorded testimony from Lakota families whose children had fallen sick after drinking creek water. The most compelling evidence came from chemical analysis. Elise had collected water samples from above and below the mine, then sent them to a territorial assayer in Laramie for testing. The results confirmed her worst fears: dramatically elevated levels of copper, lead, and arsenic in water downstream from Consolidated's operations. Enough to poison a man slowly, Dr. Harrison had written in his report. Certainly enough to cause illness in children or livestock drinking regularly from the affected stream. Now, Elise sat in the office of Circuit Judge Nathaniel Blackwood in Laramie, presenting her case, while Tokala waited outside. The judge was a thin, precise man who'd earned his appointment through political connections rather than legal brilliance. But he had a reputation for fairness when money didn't directly influence his decisions. "These are serious allegations, Mrs. Hoffman," Judge Blackwood said, reviewing the water analysis reports. "You're claiming that Consolidated mining is deliberately contaminating a navigable waterway in violation of riparian doctrine and creating a public nuisance that affects both white settlers and reservation Indians." "I'm claiming that the evidence speaks for itself, Your Honor. The photographic documentation shows clear violations of established water law. The chemical analysis proves contamination. The testimony from affected parties demonstrates actual harm." Judge Blackwood studied the photographs Elise had taken of the waste dumps. These images show poor mining practices, certainly. But proving deliberate contamination versus accidental environmental damage requires establishing intent. Intent can be inferred from the pattern of behavior. Consolidated pumps clean water from upstream sources, uses it in their mining operations, then discharges contaminated water downstream without any attempt at treatment or containment. They profit from the clean water while passing the costs of contamination to others. The legal argument was sound riparian water law required that upstream users not unreasonably interfere with downstream users' rights. The challenge was enforcement against a company with political connections and financial resources. "What remedy are you seeking?" Judge Blackwood asked. "An immediate injunction requiring Consolidated to cease discharge of contaminated water into Bitter Creek. Long-term, I want them to implement proper waste containment and compensate downstream users for damages to their water rights." Mrs. Hoffman, such an injunction could shut down their entire operation. Consolidated employs over 100 men and pays significant taxes to territorial and local governments. The economic impact The economic impact of poisoned water extends far beyond one mining company's profits. Elise kept her voice level, though German temper flared beneath her calm exterior. Every rancher, homesteader, and Indian family downstream from their operations has been harmed. The law should protect their rights equally. Judge Blackwood was quiet for a long moment, weighing legal precedent against political reality. Finally, he spoke. "I'll review your evidence and issue a decision within 10 days. In the meantime, I strongly suggest you consider consolidated settlement offers. Legal victories can be ephemeral when powerful interests are at stake." The warning was clear enough. Even if Elise won her case, enforcing the judgment against a well-connected mining syndicate would prove difficult. Justice in Wyoming territory flowed uphill toward money and influence. Outside the courthouse, Tokala waited with their horses. His weathered face showed no surprise at Elise's grim expression. "The judge will rule according to who pays him best," he said. "Perhaps. But we've established a legal record. If Judge Blackwood rules against us, we can appeal to federal authorities." Elise mounted her mare, thinking of the letters she'd already written to territorial representatives and federal officials. The federal courts have jurisdiction over navigable waterways under the Commerce Clause. You have great faith in white man's law. I have faith in persistent pressure applied in multiple directions. Anton always said that engineering failures usually result from single points of weakness. The same principle applies to legal and political systems. They rode out of Laramie in companionable silence, two unlikely allies, bound together by shared opposition to a common enemy. The October afternoon was crisp and clear, with golden aspen leaves dancing in the breeze like scattered coins. Halfway home, they encountered a roadblock. 6 men waited at a narrow pass between sandstone bluffs. Crenshaw, Kowalski, and 4 others Elise didn't recognize. All were armed and positioned to control the road with rifle fire from elevated positions. "Mrs. Hoffman," Crenshaw called as they approached. "Step down from your horse. You too, Chief." Elise felt Tokala tense beside her, his hand drifting toward the knife at his belt. The tactical situation was hopeless. They were outnumbered, caught in the open with no cover except their horses. "What do you want, Crenshaw?" "Any legal papers you might be carrying. Photographs, test results, witness statements. Anything related to your recent research activities." So Consolidated knew about her evidence gathering. Either they had sources in Judge Blackwood's office, or they'd been watching her more carefully than she'd realized. "I don't know what you mean." Crenshaw's smile was thin as a knife blade. "Search them." 2 men approached while the others maintained rifle coverage. Elise submitted to the search with cold fury, watching as they rifled through her saddlebags and confiscated Anton's notebook, the water analysis reports, and the photographs documenting Consolidated's operations. "You're making a mistake," she said. "Judge Blackwood is expecting my report. When I don't appear, you'll appear, Mrs. Hoffman. But you'll explain that your investigation found no evidence of wrongdoing, that you were mistaken about water contamination and have decided to accept Consolidated's generous offer for your homestead. And if I refuse," Crenshaw gestured toward Tokala, "your Indian friend here will be found dead on reservation land, killed while attempting to steal cattle. Regrettable, but these things happen. As for you, well, frontier women sometimes simply vanish. Claim jumpers, wild animals accidents. The territory can be dangerous for those who don't have proper protection." The threat was delivered with casual precision, like a businessman discussing quarterly profits. Elise realized that Henrik Mueller and his associates viewed her homestead as just another business problem to be solved through the most cost-effective means available. How much time do I have to consider your offer? Until tomorrow evening. Come to the mine office alone and sign the papers. Bring your deed and water rights documentation. After that, you'll have safe passage to anywhere you'd like to go. The roadblock melted away as quickly as it had formed, leaving Elise and Tokala alone in the gathering dusk. They rode in silence until they were well clear of the ambush site. Then Tokala finally spoke. You cannot trust their promises. I know. Elise's mind was already working on the problem from multiple angles. But we've lost our documented evidence. Without proof, Judge Blackwood will rule against us. There are other kinds of proof, other kinds of justice. What do you mean? Tokala reined his horse to a stop and turned to face her. I mean that sometimes the only way to fight poison is with fire. Sometimes legal papers matter less than who controls the ground. The suggestion carried implications that made Elise's civilized instincts recoil. But her practical German mind recognized the truth in his words. Consolidated had just demonstrated that they were willing to use violence to protect their interests. Responding with purely legal measures would be like bringing engineering drawings to a gunfight. What did you have in mind? Meet me at the old trapper's cabin tomorrow before dawn. Come prepared for a long ride and hard work. Tokala's expression was grim as winter. If white man's law won't stop them, we'll find ways that will. As they rode toward their respective homes, Elise reflected on how quickly her situation had deteriorated. 24 hours ago, she'd been a law-abiding widow, seeking legal remedy for water contamination. Now she was contemplating alliance with a Lakota warrior in what amounted to guerrilla warfare against a powerful mining syndicate. The transformation troubled her less than it should have. Perhaps 6 months of frontier life had taught her that civilization was a luxury that not everyone could afford. Elise arrived at the trapper's cabin before dawn, carrying her Spencer rifle and enough supplies for several days in rough country. Tokala emerged from the shadows like a hunting wolf leading 2 pack horses loaded with equipment she couldn't identify in the pre-dawn darkness. Where are we going? She asked, checking her rifle's action in the growing light. To see Henrik Muller's real operation. The mine you've been watching is just the beginning. They rode north through dense timber, following game trails that wound deeper into the mountains. Tokala moved with the confidence of someone who knew every ridge and valley, while Elise marveled at the pristine wilderness around them, country that seemed untouched by mining, logging, or any other industrial activity. After 3 hours of steady climbing, they crested a ridge, and Tokala called a halt. Before them stretched a hidden valley carved by glacial action into a natural bowl perhaps 2 miles across. What filled that bowl made Elise catch her breath. Mein Gott in Himmel. The valley contained not one mine, but a dozen separate operations connected by narrow-gauge railroad tracks. Steam shovels worked massive open pits, while hydraulic monitors stripped entire hillsides. The scale dwarfed anything she'd seen at the Bitter Creek site. This was industrial mining on a level that could alter the landscape permanently. Mueller's real prize, Tokala said grimly. He's been developing this in secret for 2 years. The Bitter Creek operation is just a diversion to keep territorial authorities focused elsewhere. Elise studied the scene with an engineer's eye for detail. The railroad tracks led east through a narrow canyon, probably toward the Union Pacific Main Line. Timber cutting operations on the surrounding slopes provided lumber for mining infrastructure and fuel for the steam engines. Most ominously, every stream flowing out of the valley showed the telltale discoloration of heavy mineral contamination. And where does that water flow? North to the Platte River, then east to the Missouri and Mississippi. By the time it reaches populated areas, it's diluted enough not to cause immediate illness. But the poison spreads. The scale of environmental damage was staggering. Mahler wasn't just contaminating a local creek, he was systematically poisoning water supplies across thousands of square miles. And he was doing it in secret, using the Bitter Creek operation as a decoy, while developing this hidden valley under territorial authorities' noses. How did you discover this? Lakota scouts range far to hunt and gather medicines. We noticed the dead fish, the poisoned streams, the strange sickness in animals that drank contaminated water. It took time to track the source. Elise opened her notebook and began sketching the layout, estimating the scope of operations, and calculating potential environmental impact. Her German engineering training had included courses on hydraulic systems and chemical processes. She understood exactly what Miller was doing and why it would prove catastrophically damaging in the long term. "This explains why he wants my homestead so desperately," she murmured. "He needs to control the Bitter Creek drainage to hide what's happening here." More than that, look at the railroad tracks. Elise followed his pointing finger to where the narrow gauge line disappeared into the eastern canyon. If her mental map was accurate, that route would emerge somewhere near her homestead, probably in the area where Bitter Creek cut through the bluffs below her property. "He's planning to ship ore through my land. Ore and equipment. Maybe workers and supplies too. With your homestead, he controls the best transportation route from this valley to the Union Pacific Main Line." The revelation recast everything she'd learned about Muller's operations. He wasn't just a mining magnate seeking profit from territorial resources. He was building an industrial empire based on systematic environmental destruction and hidden from regulatory oversight. "We need to document this," she said, reaching for Anton's camera equipment. "Carefully. There are guards, and not just company men. Mueller employs Pinkerton agents and ex-military personnel. They shoot first and worry about legal justification later." They spent the morning photographing the secret operations from concealed positions along the ridge. Elise's technical training proved valuable. She knew which aspects of the mining process would look most damaging to territorial officials and federal regulators. Steam-powered equipment destroying pristine wilderness. Contaminated water flowing toward major river systems. Evidence of night operations designed to avoid official scrutiny. By noon, they had enough photographic evidence to expose Muller's entire operation. But as they prepared to leave, the sound of approaching horses made them scramble for deeper cover. A party of riders emerged from the valley, Mueller himself accompanied by Crenshaw and half a dozen armed guards. They stopped directly below Elise and Tokala's position, close enough for conversation to carry clearly in the thin mountain air. "The Hoffman woman is becoming a serious problem," Mueller was saying in accented English that marked him as a fellow German. "Judge Blackwood says she's gathered enough evidence to cause real legal difficulties." "We intercepted her documentation yesterday," Crenshaw replied. "But she'll just gather more evidence. And there's the Indian she's been working with. He knows too much about our operations." "Then eliminate them both. Make it look like an accident claim jumpers, Indian raiders, whatever story will satisfy territorial authorities." Elise felt cold fury rise in her chest. Henrik Mueller was casually ordering their deaths as if discussing livestock purchases. The civilized German businessman was revealed as a callous predator willing to commit murder to protect his illegal profits. "What about the broader legal situation?" one of the guards asked. "Federal authorities are starting to ask questions about mining practices in the territory." Muller's laugh was harsh as winter wind. "Federal authorities can be managed through proper political contributions. I have friends in Washington who ensure that territorial mining operations receive minimal federal oversight. As long as we avoid drawing national attention, we can operate as we choose. The secret is controlling information flow, Crenshaw added. Kill the widow and the Indian buy off Judge Blackwood, and there's no evidence of wrongdoing. Without documentation, it's just accusations from unreliable sources. The casual discussion of murder and judicial corruption made Elise's blood boil. These men viewed human life as just another business expense to be managed through the most cost-effective means available. But Mueller's next words revealed something even more sinister. I've waited 15 years for this opportunity, he said, his voice carrying strange emotion. 15 years since Anton Hoffman cost me everything in Colorado. His widow's obstinacy is almost poetic. She'll die defending the same land that her husband's engineering destroyed my previous operations. Elise nearly gasped aloud. Mueller knew Anton had some connection to her husband's past work in Colorado mining. The revelation suggested that her current troubles weren't just about water rights and territorial expansion, and they were rooted in some ancient grievance that predated her Wyoming homestead. The past is past, Crenshaw said pragmatically. What matters now is securing the transportation route and eliminating threats to our operation. You're right, of course. But I confess to taking personal satisfaction in destroying the Hoffman legacy completely. Mueller's voice hardened. Kill them tonight. Make it thorough. I want no survivors and no witnesses. The murder party departed, leaving Elise and Tokala alone with the terrible knowledge of what was coming. But more importantly, they now knew that Mueller's vendetta against her family went far beyond simple business considerations. We have to get back and warn the others. Elise said, her mind already racing ahead to defensive preparations. What others? You live alone. My people are scattered across the reservation. Then we'll have to make our stand together. She met Tokala's dark gaze with determination forged in German steel and frontier necessity. But first, I need to understand what Mueller meant about Anton costing him everything 15 years ago. There's more to this than water rights and mining claims. As they began their careful descent from the ridge, Elise reflected on how completely her situation had changed. She'd started out seeking legal remedy for water contamination. Now she was planning guerrilla warfare against a German industrialist who apparently harbored a 15-year grudge against her dead husband. The personal had become political, and the political had become deadly. Tonight, Henrik Mueller would discover that Elise Hoffman possessed the same engineering brilliance that had once cost him everything, and the frontier toughness to use it against him. Elise and Tokala reached her homestead as afternoon shadows lengthened across Bitter Creek. The cabin looked peaceful in the golden light, but Elise's trained eye caught subtle signs of intrusion. Scratches on the door frame boot prints in the soft earth around the porch, and her milk cow grazing in the wrong pasture. They've been here, she said, checking the Spencer rifle's action. Recently, the tracks are fresh. Tokala studied the ground with a tracker's practiced eye. 4 men, maybe 5. They searched, but tried to hide their presence. Inside the cabin, Elise's suspicions were confirmed. Her possessions had been carefully rifled with items replaced in almost their original positions. But almost wasn't good enough to fool someone who'd been living alone and knew exactly how she'd left everything. They were looking for something specific, she murmured, checking Anton's desk in the corner. The engineering books appeared undisturbed, but one of the desk drawers showed scratches around the lock. Something they didn't find yesterday when they took my documentation. She knelt beside the stone hearth and worked loose a carefully concealed brick in the fireplace foundation. The hiding place had been Anton's idea, a German engineer's solution for protecting important documents from fire theft or hostile search. Behind the brick lay a metal strongbox containing Anton's most private papers. "What are you looking for?" Tokala asked, keeping watch through the cabin's single window. "Answers about Muller's connection to Anton. 15 years ago puts it around 1867, when Anton was working Colorado mining projects before we came to Wyoming." The strongbox contained engineering reports, mining surveys, and correspondence from Anton's Colorado period. Elise had never read these papers carefully. They represented a part of her husband's life that had ended before she knew him. But now she studied them with desperate attention to detail. Most of the documents dealt with routine mining engineering, structural surveys, water management systems, and equipment specifications for various Colorado operations. But a thick folder marked "Confidential, H. Mueller Enterprises" caught her attention. The folder contained a devastating technical report dated March 1867. Anton had been hired to investigate structural failures at Miller's Colorado mines failures that had killed 17 workers in a series of accidents over 6 months. His engineering analysis was methodical and damning. Systematic violations of accepted mining practices, Anton had written in his precise German script. Inadequate timber supports, improper ventilation, dangerous excavation techniques designed to maximize short-term ore extraction at the expense of worker safety. The deaths were entirely preventable and resulted directly from cost-cutting measures that ignored basic engineering principles. But the most explosive revelation came in Anton's summary recommendations. This operation should be immediately shut down by territorial authorities. The evidence suggests deliberate negligence amounting to criminal recklessness. I am forwarding copies of this report to federal mining inspectors, territorial officials, and newspaper editors in Denver and Colorado Springs. Elise felt pieces of the puzzle clicking into place with mechanical precision. Anton's report had apparently destroyed Muller's Colorado operations, costing him a fortune, and driving him to Wyoming territory to rebuild his mining empire. Muller's current vendetta wasn't just about water rights. It was about revenge against the German engineer who'd exposed his criminal practices 15 years ago. He wants to destroy our homestead because Anton destroyed his previous operation, she said, showing Tokala the relevant passages. This is personal. Tokala studied the documents with interest. Your husband was a man of honor. He chose justice over profit. And it made us targets for Muller's revenge. Elise continued reading, finding more correspondence that painted an increasingly clear picture. Anton had indeed caused Muller's ruin in Colorado, but he'd done it to prevent more mining deaths and environmental destruction. The final document in the folder was a letter from Mueller himself, dated April 1867. Hoffman, your report has cost me everything I built in Colorado. Federal authorities have seized my operations, territorial officials have revoked my mining permits, and investors have withdrawn their backing. You have destroyed 15 years of work with your self-righteous engineering principles. I will not forget this betrayal. Someday, when you least expect it, I will repay what you have done to me. H. Mueller. The threat was clear and direct. Mueller had been planning revenge against Anton for 15 years. When consumption claimed her husband Mueller had simply transferred his vendetta to Anton's widow and the homestead they'd built together. Now we understand why he wants your land so desperately, Tokala observed. It's not just business. It's completion of a 15-year revenge. Which means he won't stop until he's destroyed everything Anton built. Elise felt the familiar cold anger rising, the German determination that had sustained her through Anton's death and 6 months of fighting claim jumpers. But he's made one critical error in his calculations. What error? He assumes that destroying Anton's widow will complete his revenge. But I'm not just Anton's widow, I'm a German engineer in my own right. Anton taught me everything he knew about mining water systems and structural engineering. She reached for her husband's surveying equipment with hands that no longer trembled. Muller wants to finish what he started 15 years ago. But he's about to discover that the Hoffman legacy includes more than just land and water rights. Outside, the October sun was setting behind the Medicine Bow Mountains, painting the valley in shades of gold and crimson. Elise realized that this might be the last sunset she'd see from her homestead porch. Tonight, Muller's killers would come to eliminate the final obstacle to his Wyoming mining empire. But they would find that eliminating Elise Hoffman required more than simple murder. It required defeating the same engineering brilliance that had destroyed Muller's Colorado operations, now applied to the tactical problem of survival in hostile territory. "We need to prepare defenses," she said, studying the homestead with fresh eyes. "If Muller wants a war, I'll give him one he'll remember." Elise and Tokala spent the remaining daylight hours preparing for siege warfare. The homestead's location offered both advantages and vulnerabilities. The creek provided water and a natural barrier, while the surrounding timber offered concealment for attackers, but also fields of fire for defenders. "They'll come at night," Tokala said, studying the approaches to the cabin. "Probably just before dawn, when most people sleep deepest." "How many men?" 6 or 8 based on what we overheard. Enough to ensure success, not so many as to attract territorial attention if things go badly. Elise nodded, calculating angles and distances with an engineer's precision. The cabin's log construction would stop rifle bullets, but the single window and door created vulnerabilities. More problematically, attackers could simply burn them out if they controlled the surrounding ground. "We can't fight a conventional defense," she said. "They have superior numbers and firepower. We need to use terrain and surprise to equalize the odds." Working together, they prepared a series of defensive positions around the homestead. Tokala's wilderness skills complemented Elise's engineering knowledge. He understood how to use natural concealment, while she calculated fields of fire and structural weak points. Their most important preparation was the tunnel. Years ago, Anton had dug a root cellar beneath the cabin's floor, connected to a concealed exit near the creek by a narrow tunnel that could serve as an escape route during Indian raids or claim jumper attacks. The tunnel was cramped and uncomfortable, but it would allow them to move unseen between defensive positions. "If they surround the cabin, we can use this to flank them," Elise explained, showing Tokala the concealed entrance behind the woodpile. "They'll expect us to be trapped inside, while we're actually moving freely around the perimeter." As darkness fell, they took their positions and waited. Elise crouched in the cabin's front window with her Spencer rifle, while Tokala moved to a concealed position near the creek, where he could cover the most likely approach routes. Between them lay Anton's surveying equipment, arranged to create crossfire zones and killing fields that would maximize their defensive advantages. The attack came 2 hours before dawn. Elise heard them first, the soft whisper of men moving through tall grass, trying to approach silently, but betrayed by small sounds that her heightened senses caught clearly. 6 men, as Tokala had predicted, led by Crenshaw, and spreading out to surround the cabin. She let them get close, waiting until they'd committed to their attack positions before opening fire. The Spencer's .52 caliber bullet took one man in the chest, spinning him around with the brutal impact of a heavy slug. The muzzle flash revealed her position, drawing return fire that splintered the window frame and sent glass fragments flying. "Elise," Crenshaw's voice carried across the darkness. "Come out with your hands up. We just want to talk." She answered with another shot, this one aimed at muzzle flashes from the timber line. A man screamed, suggesting at least a wounding hit. From the creek came the distinctive crack of Tokala's Winchester, followed by more shouting as the attackers realized they faced defenders in multiple positions. "Burn them out," someone yelled. "Use the coal oil." That was Elise's cue to abandon the cabin. She slipped through the floor hatch into the root cellar, then crawled through the tunnel toward the creek exit. Behind her, she could hear the attackers breaking down the cabin door and cursing when they found it empty. She emerged from the tunnel 30 yards from the cabin behind a fallen cottonwood that provided perfect concealment. From this position, she could see 3 men silhouetted against the cabin's lighted windows while they searched for her and prepared to set the building ablaze. The Spencer spoke again, and another attacker went down. But return fire was getting closer, and she could hear men moving through the brush to flank her position. Time to relocate again. The next hour became a deadly game of cat and mouse in the timber along Bitter Creek. Elise and Tokala used their superior knowledge of local terrain to stay mobile, while the attackers struggled to coordinate their movements in unfamiliar darkness. Anton's engineering had provided defensive advantages, but ultimate success depended on superior tactics and marksmanship. The tide turned when one of Muller's men made a fatal error. Kowalski, the scarred brute who'd accompanied Crenshaw on previous visits, grew frustrated with the elusive defenders and made a direct assault on Tokala's position near the creek. He charged through the timber with a revolver in each hand, firing wildly and shouting threats in broken English and what sounded like Polish. Tokala waited until Kowalski was close enough to guarantee a killing shot, then put a Winchester bullet through his heart. The big man fell face first into Bitter Creek, his blood mixing with the water he'd helped poison through his work for Consolidated Mining. "Kowalski's down," someone shouted from the timber. "Fall back to the horses." Crenshaw's voice carried notes of panic. "This isn't working." But Elise had no intention of letting them escape to report failure and return with reinforcements. As the survivors tried to withdraw toward their horses, she and Tokala used the tunnel system and their superior knowledge of local terrain to cut off the retreat. The Spencer's final shot of the night took Crenshaw himself catching him as he tried to mount his horse in the pre-dawn darkness. He fell with a scream that carried clearly across the valley, then lay still in the grass beside Bitter Creek. Of the 6 attackers, 3 were dead, and 2 were wounded badly enough to require medical attention. The survivor, a young company guard, who'd probably never expected to face professional quality defensive tactics, rode hard toward Laramie with news of the disaster. As sunrise painted the Medicine Bow Mountains in shades of gold and crimson, Elise and Tokala surveyed the aftermath of their victory. The cabin had suffered damage, but remained structurally sound. More importantly, they had survived Muller's first serious attempt to eliminate them through violence. "He'll be more careful next time," Tokala observed, checking the weapons taken from dead attackers. "There won't be a next time." Elise's voice carried the cold certainty of German engineering logic applied to tactical problems. "We're done playing defense. Now we take the war to Henrik Muller." She studied the photographic evidence they'd gathered at Muller's secret mining operation, thinking about how to use it most effectively against a man who'd been planning revenge for 15 years. Legal channels had proven inadequate, and Muller had demonstrated his willingness to use murder to protect his interests. But he'd made the same mistake that had destroyed his Colorado operations. He'd underestimated the engineering capabilities of someone named Hoffman. This time, however, the engineering would be applied to problems of tactical demolition rather than mining safety. "What do you have in mind?" Tokala asked. Elise smiled with the dangerous satisfaction of a German engineer who'd calculated the precise solution to a complex problem. I'm going to give Henrik Muller exactly what he gave Anton 15 years ago, complete destruction of everything he's built. But this time the destruction will be permanent. As they prepared for the next phase of their war against consolidated mining, Elise reflected on how completely her life had changed since Anton's death. 6 months ago, she'd been a grieving widow, trying to maintain a homestead through legal means. Now she was planning industrial sabotage against a mining syndicate that had threatened not just her land, but her life. The transformation would have shocked her civilized German relatives. But frontier Wyoming had its own rules, and survival required adapting to local conditions. Muller wanted total war. She would give him exactly what he'd asked for. 3 days after the failed assault on her homestead, Elise met with Judge Blackwood in his private chambers. She carried a leather portfolio containing the photographs from Muller's secret mining operation testimony from Lakota families affected by water contamination and detailed engineering analysis of environmental damage. But her most compelling evidence was personal. The burns on her arms from fighting the fire that Muller's men had set, and the bullet graze across her shoulder that proved they'd come to kill rather than negotiate. Mrs. Hoffman, these are extremely serious allegations, Judge Blackwood said, studying the photographs with obvious dismay. If accurate, they suggest criminal violations of territorial law on a massive scale. The evidence speaks for itself, Your Honor. Henrik Muller is operating secret mining facilities that deliberately contaminate water supplies across thousands of square miles. When I attempted to document these violations through proper legal channels, his agents tried to murder me. The photographs certainly show extensive mining operations that weren't disclosed in Consolidated's territorial filings. And these water analysis reports? He shook his head grimly. Dr. Harrison's chemical analysis indicates contamination levels that pose serious health risks. Elise pressed her advantage. I'm requesting an immediate court-appointed special master in Chancery to investigate Muller's operations. Someone with technical expertise who can verify these findings and recommend appropriate legal remedies. Judge Blackwood was quiet for a long moment, weighing legal precedent against political pressure. Finally, he reached for his pen. I'm issuing a preliminary injunction requiring Consolidated Mining to cease all operations that discharge contaminated water into territorial streams. Additionally, I'm appointing Special Master William Thornton to conduct a comprehensive investigation of their mining practices. The legal victory was more complete than Elise had dared hope. Thornton was a former Army engineer with experience in mining operations and a reputation for thoroughness. If anyone could document the full scope of Muller's environmental crimes, it would be him. But legal victories took time to implement, and Muller had already proven his willingness to use violence against obstacles to his plans. Elise didn't intend to wait passively while territorial authorities slowly ground through bureaucratic processes. That night, she and Tokala rode toward Muller's secret valley, with enough dynamite to alter the landscape permanently. Are you certain about this? Tokala asked as they approached the concealed railroad grade that connected Muller's operations to the outside world. Absolutely certain. Elise checked the fusing on the explosive charges they'd prepared. Muller has been poisoning water supplies for 2 years while bribing officials to look the other way. Legal remedies are necessary, but insufficient. Sometimes engineering problems require engineering solutions. The railroad was Muller's most vulnerable asset and the key to his entire operation. Without rail transport to move equipment supplies and ore, his secret valley mining would become economically impossible. More importantly, destroying the railroad would strand his current workforce and heavy machinery in an isolated location where territorial authorities could easily investigate. They worked through the night, placing dynamite charges at critical points along the rail line. Elise's engineering training proved invaluable. She understood exactly how much explosive to use, where to place it for maximum structural damage, and how to time the detonations for systematic destruction. The charges were set to detonate at dawn, beginning at the valley end of the line, and moving progressively toward the Union Pacific connection. The sequence would trap Muller's operations while destroying his transportation infrastructure piece by piece. "This will close his mining permanently?" Tokola asked. "It will cost him months to rebuild, during which time Special Master Thornton will complete his investigation, and territorial authorities will have legal grounds to seize Muller's assets." Elise smiled with grim satisfaction. "But more importantly, it will demonstrate that actions have consequences, even for powerful men who think they're above the law." They withdrew to a safe distance and waited for sunrise. As the first explosion echoed across the valley, followed by a systematic series of detonations that marched along the railroad grade like thunder, Elise felt the same cold satisfaction that Anton must have experienced when he destroyed Muller's Colorado operations 15 years ago. The difference was that Anton had used legal weapons, technical reports, federal investigations, and regulatory enforcement. Elise was using the more direct tools of frontier justice applied with German engineering precision to achieve permanent results. By full daylight, Muller's railroad was completely destroyed. Twisted rails shattered bridges, and demolished roadbeds stretched for miles through terrain too difficult for easy rebuilding. His secret mining operation was effectively cut off from the outside world, stranded in a valley that territorial authorities could now investigate at their leisure. More importantly, Elise had sent a message that would resonate throughout Wyoming Territory's mining community. Environmental criminals would face consequences beyond legal penalties. They would face the kind of frontier justice that left permanent scars on the landscape and the balance sheets. "What happens now?" Tokola asked as they rode away from the destruction. "Now we wait for Muller's response. He'll either accept defeat and abandon his Wyoming operations, or he'll escalate the conflict to levels that will attract federal attention." Elise studied the smoke rising from the demolished railroad. "Either outcome serves our purposes." As they returned to her homestead, Elise reflected on how completely she'd embraced frontier solutions to frontier problems. 6 months ago, the idea of industrial sabotage would have horrified her German sensibilities. Now it seemed like the most rational response to criminal behavior that legal authorities couldn't adequately address. Mueller had wanted to complete his 15-year revenge against the Hoffman family. Instead, he'd awakened the same engineering brilliance that had destroyed his Colorado empire, now applied to the tactical problem of defending territorial water supplies against systematic poisoning. The war was far from over, but the initiative had shifted decisively. Mueller would have to respond to her actions rather than implementing his own plans. And in a contest between German engineering and frontier brutality, Elise liked her chances of ultimate victory. Henrik Mueller stood in the ruins of his railroad terminus, studying twisted steel rails and shattered bridge timbers with the expression of a man calculating massive financial losses. The systematic destruction had been professionally executed. Whoever had planned this sabotage understood both explosive techniques and railroad engineering. 17 years of work, he said quietly, speaking German to his chief engineer, Klaus Weber. 17 years building what one night destroyed. Mein Herr, the damage can be repaired. 6 months, perhaps 8, with sufficient workers and materials. 6 months during which territorial authorities will swarm over our operations like locusts. 6 months of legal investigations, federal oversight, and newspaper attention. Muller's voice hardened with controlled fury. The Hoffman woman has cost us everything exactly as her husband did in Colorado. Weber, a thin man, whose technical competence was matched only by his complete lack of moral scruples, gestured toward the secret valley where millions of dollars in mining equipment sat stranded by the railroad's destruction. What are your orders, Herr Miller? Do we attempt reconstruction or abandon the operations entirely? Muller was quiet for several minutes, thinking through options with the methodical precision of a man who'd built industrial empires through careful planning and ruthless execution. The Wyoming venture represented his last opportunity for major success. At 62, he lacked the time and energy to start over in yet another territory. Neither, he said finally. We implement the final contingency. Weber's face went pale. The dam project, but Herr Miller, the risks are acceptable given our current circumstances. If we cannot profitably operate in this valley, we ensure that no one else can either. Muller's smile was cold as winter moonlight. And we eliminate the Hoffman problem permanently. The dam project was Muller's most closely guarded secret, a plan so audacious and destructive that even his own engineers had recommended against it. For 2 years, his crews had been secretly excavating a massive dam site in the narrow canyon, where Bitter Creek cut through the mountains above Elise's homestead. The dam would create a reservoir capable of storing millions of gallons of contaminated water from his mining operations. More importantly, it could be deliberately collapsed to send a devastating flood down Bitter Creek, a flood that would destroy everything in its path, including Elise's homestead and several Lakota settlements downstream. Begin moving the equipment immediately, Muller ordered. Use pack animals if necessary. I want the dam completed within 2 weeks. Mein Herr, such speed requires cutting safety margins to dangerous levels. If the structure fails prematurely, it's designed to fail, Klaus. The question is whether it fails when we choose or when natural forces decide for us. The plan was elegantly simple and completely ruthless. Muller would complete the dam using concrete mixed with contaminated mine tailings, creating a structure that would hold water temporarily, but was guaranteed to collapse under pressure. When it failed, the resulting flood would carry millions of tons of poisoned sediment downstream, permanently contaminating Bitter Creek and making the entire drainage basin uninhabitable. The environmental damage would be blamed on natural causes, a tragic engineering failure caused by Wyoming Territory's harsh climate and unstable geology. No one would suspect deliberate sabotage, especially since Muller himself would lose substantial assets in the flood. But the secondary benefits justified the costs. Elise Hoffman would be eliminated, along with her homestead and her inconvenient knowledge of his operations. The Lakota families downstream would be scattered or killed, removing their troublesome testimony about water contamination, and federal investigators would find nothing but flood-damaged ruins instead of evidence of systematic environmental crimes. There is one additional consideration, Weber said carefully. The Hoffman woman has proven herself remarkably resourceful. If she discovers our plans, she won't. Muller's voice carried absolute certainty. We'll use decoy operations to convince her that we're rebuilding the railroad while the real work proceeds at the dam site. By the time she realizes what we're doing, it will be too late to stop us. As Muller's crews began the desperate race to complete their final contingency, Elise was conducting her own surveillance of Consolidated's activities. From concealed positions in the mountains, she watched pack trains moving equipment toward what appeared to be railroad reconstruction sites. They're working faster than I expected, she told Tokala as they observed the activity through Anton's surveying telescope. Muller must be under tremendous pressure from his investors. Something feels wrong about this, Tokala replied, studying the movement patterns with a warrior's instinct for tactical deception. Too many men moving in the wrong directions. Too much equipment for simple railroad repair. Elise adjusted the telescope focus, trying to identify specific machinery being transported by mule train. Most of it appeared to be standard railroad equipment: rails, spikes, bridge timbers, and construction tools. But several loads were covered with canvas tarps that concealed their contents. "We need to get closer," she decided. "See exactly what they're transporting and where it's going." That night, they infiltrated Muller's supply lines and discovered the truth. Hidden beneath the canvas tarps were concrete mixing equipment, structural steel, and massive quantities of Portland cement materials for dam construction rather than railroad repair. "Mein Gott," Elise whispered, recognizing the implications immediately. "He's not rebuilding the railroad. He's building a dam." "Where?" Tokala demanded. "And why?" Elise's engineering mind raced through the possibilities, calculating water volumes, drainage patterns, and potential dam sites in the Bitter Creek watershed. Only one location made hydraulic sense: the narrow canyon 3 miles upstream from her homestead, where the creek cut through solid granite formations. If he builds a dam there and fills it with contaminated water from his mining operations... She stopped, horrified by the implications of her own analysis. What would happen? He could release a flood that would carry millions of tons of poisoned sediment downstream. It would destroy everything along Bitter Creek, my homestead, the Lakota settlements, all the ranches and farms that depend on clean water. Tokala's expression hardened with understanding. And he would blame it on engineering failure. Natural disaster, not deliberate destruction. Exactly. The perfect crime disguised as a tragic accident. Elise felt German rage building in her chest like steam pressure in a boiler. He's planning to commit mass murder and environmental destruction on a scale that makes his previous crimes look insignificant. They had stumbled onto Mueller's final contingency, a plan so ruthlessly comprehensive that it would eliminate all opposition while destroying evidence of his criminal activities. If successful, it would leave him free to rebuild his Wyoming empire without interference from inconvenient witnesses or territorial authorities. But Henrik Mueller had made one critical error in his calculations. He'd assumed that Elise Hoffman would react like a typical frontier widow, with fear, desperation, and eventually capitulation to superior force. Instead, he'd awakened the full fury of German engineering applied to problems of tactical destruction. And this time, Elise intended to ensure that Mueller's defeat would be as complete and permanent as the environmental damage he'd planned to inflict on Wyoming territory. "We have to stop him," she said, her voice carrying the cold certainty of absolute determination. "How his crew has a 2-week head start and we're only 2 people against dozens of workers." Elise smiled with the dangerous satisfaction of an engineer who'd calculated the precise solution to an impossible problem. "We're going to give Henrik Mueller exactly what he's trying to give us: a catastrophic engineering failure that destroys everything he's built. But this time, the failure will be carefully planned, precisely executed, and timed for maximum damage to his operations, rather than ours." Elise spent 3 sleepless nights studying Anton's engineering texts and calculating the hydraulic forces involved in Mueller's dam project. The mathematics were complex, but the principles were straightforward. Water pressure increased exponentially with depth, and even small structural flaws could cascade into catastrophic failure under sufficient load. Mueller's dam was being built with criminal haste and deliberate design flaws that would ensure eventual collapse. But Elise realized she could accelerate that collapse and control its timing to minimize downstream damage while maximizing destruction of Mueller's operations. The key is understanding his construction schedule. she explained to Tokala as they studied detailed sketches of the dam site. He's building fast and cheap using contaminated concrete that will weaken over time. If we can introduce additional structural flaws at critical points, we can force the collapse to occur before he fills the reservoir with poisoned water. And if we time it wrong, then we create the very disaster we're trying to prevent. Elise's engineering training had taught her to think systematically about failure modes and safety margins. But doing nothing guarantees that Muller will complete his plan and destroy everything downstream. At least this way we control the variables. Their plan required infiltrating the dam construction site and placing shaped charges at structurally critical points. The explosives would be timed to detonate when the dam was nearly complete. But before Muller began filling the reservoir, creating a spectacular engineering failure that would destroy his equipment while releasing only clean water downstream. The technical challenges were formidable. They needed to place charges precisely where they would cause maximum structural damage time the detonations to occur at the optimal moment, and do all of this while evading security guards who shoot trespassers on sight. But Elise's German thoroughness and Tokala's wilderness skills proved to be an effective combination. Over 4 nights of careful reconnaissance, they mapped the construction site, identified guard positions, and calculated the exact placement needed for their demolition charges. The concrete is still curing, Elise observed on their final scouting mission. If we place charges in the foundation while it's still soft, the explosions will create fracture patterns that propagate through the entire structure. When do we make the attempt? Tomorrow night. Muller's crew is working around the clock to meet his deadline, which means they'll be exhausted and less alert. And the moon will be dark, giving us maximum concealment. They approach the dam site through the timber on the canyon's north rim, carrying enough dynamite to level a city block. Elise had calculated the precise amount needed. Too little would cause cosmetic damage rather than structural failure, while too much might create the uncontrolled flood they were trying to prevent. The construction site sprawled across the canyon floor like an industrial infection. Concrete mixers worked constantly, fed by conveyor belts that carried cement, sand, and gravel from supply dumps. Steam-powered equipment provided artificial lighting that turned night into harsh industrial day. But security was lighter than expected. Muller's guards were concentrated around the equipment and supply areas, leaving the dam structure itself relatively unprotected. Apparently, no one had considered the possibility of sabotage directed at the engineering work rather than the valuable machinery. Overconfidence, Elise murmured as they descended toward the dam foundation. Muller assumes that no one else understands his engineering well enough to attack it effectively. They placed the charges with surgical precision, using Elise's knowledge of structural engineering to target the points where explosive damage would cascade through the entire foundation. Each charge was positioned to create specific fracture patterns that would weaken the concrete systematically rather than randomly. The most critical placement was at the dam's center, where water pressure would be greatest when the reservoir filled. Elise spent nearly an hour positioning a large charge in a concrete form that would be filled at dawn, ensuring that the explosive would be permanently embedded in the structure's weakest point. "How long until detonation?" Tokala asked as they prepared to withdraw. 72 hours. Long enough for the concrete to cure around our charges, but soon enough to prevent Muller from filling the reservoir. Elise checked her pocket watch, calculating precisely when the timed fuses would burn through. The explosion will occur at 3 in the morning, when the night shift is least alert and the day shift hasn't arrived yet. They retreated to a safe observation point on the canyon rim and settled down to wait. Over the next 3 days, they watched Muller's crews work frantically to complete the dam structure. Concrete poured steadily into forms that now contained enough dynamite to level a mountain. On the third night, Elise and Tokala took positions where they could observe the results of their sabotage. The dam rose nearly 50 feet above the canyon floor, an impressive feat of engineering that would have been admirable if not for its criminal purpose. At exactly 3 in the morning, the charges detonated. The explosions came in sequence, beginning at the dam's foundation and rippling upward through the structure like controlled lightning. Each blast created precisely calculated fracture patterns that propagated through the curing concrete, systematically destroying the structural integrity that Muller's crews had worked weeks to achieve. The dam didn't simply collapse, it disintegrated. Millions of tons of concrete and steel dissolved into rubble that choked the canyon floor and permanently blocked any future construction at this site. The destruction was complete, irreversible, and timed to occur before any contaminated water could be stored behind the structure. "It's over," Elise said with quiet satisfaction, watching the dust settle over Mueller's ruined dream. He can't rebuild this quickly enough to matter, and territorial authorities will arrive long before he can start over. But her satisfaction was tempered by the knowledge that Mueller still possessed dangerous assets and desperate motivations. A man who would plan mass murder to protect his business interests wouldn't surrender easily to engineering failure and legal investigation. "What's his next move?" Tokala asked. "Flight or final confrontation. He's lost his railroad, his dam, and his secret mining operation. Either he cuts his losses and flees Wyoming territory, or he makes one last attempt to eliminate the threats to his freedom." Elise suspected she knew which option Mueller would choose. German pride and 15 years of planning wouldn't be abandoned easily, especially by a man who'd already committed multiple murders to protect his interests. The war between Heinrich Mueller and the Hoffman legacy was approaching its climax, and Elise intended to ensure that this time the German engineer would achieve permanent victory over the forces of corruption and environmental destruction. As dawn broke over the canyon, revealing the full scope of destruction they'd inflicted on Mueller's final contingency, Elise felt the same cold satisfaction that Anton must have experienced when he destroyed Mueller's Colorado operations. The difference was that this time the victory would be complete and irreversible. Mueller's Wyoming empire was finished. Now she had to survive his inevitable attempt at personal revenge. Heinrich Mueller received news of the dam's destruction while reviewing financial reports in his temporary office at the Bitter Creek mining site. The messenger, a mud-splattered construction foreman, delivered the catastrophic update with the stunned disbelief of a man who'd witnessed impossible destruction. Gone, Herr Mueller, all of it. The dam, the equipment, even the access road. Nothing left but rubble and twisted steel. Mueller set down his pen with the careful precision of a man maintaining composure through supreme effort of will. 17 years of planning. Millions of dollars in investment. His last opportunity for major success in American mining all destroyed by a German widow who refused to understand her proper place in the natural order of things. "Sabotage?" he asked quietly. "Had to be. No way that much concrete fails naturally, especially not in sequence patterns like that. Someone knew exactly where to place charges for maximum structural damage." Mueller nodded, unsurprised by the confirmation. Elise Hoffman possessed her husband's engineering brilliance, plus a frontier ruthlessness that Anton had lacked. She'd systematically destroyed his railroad, his secret mining operation, and now his final contingency with the methodical precision of a German engineer solving technical problems. "Herr Mueller," the foreman shifted nervously, unsure how his employer would react to such devastating news. "What are your orders?" "Evacuate all personnel from the valley operations. Destroy any equipment we can't transport and any records that might interest territorial authorities." Mueller's voice carried the cold finality of absolute decision. "We're finished here." But even as he issued orders for withdrawal from Wyoming territory, Mueller's mind was calculating one final solution to the Hoffman problem. Legal remedies had failed. Economic pressure had proven insufficient. Direct violence had been expertly countered by superior tactics and local knowledge. That left only personal confrontation, the kind of frontier justice that settled disputes through individual combat rather than legal proceedings. If he couldn't destroy Elise Hoffman through institutional means, he would face her directly and end their 15-year conflict through the simple expedient of superior firepower. 2 days later, as October snow began falling in the Medicine Bow Mountains, Mueller rode alone to the Hoffman homestead. He carried a matched pair of Prussian dueling pistols that had belonged to his father, weapons designed for settling matters of honor between German gentlemen according to traditional codes. Elise was waiting on her cabin porch when he arrived, the Spencer rifle resting across her knees in a gesture that was neither threatening nor welcoming. She'd expected this final confrontation from the moment she destroyed his dam. German pride demanded personal resolution of conflicts that couldn't be settled through other means. Frau Hoffman. Mueller dismounted and approached the porch with formal courtesy, speaking German for the first time since their conflict began. I believe we have unfinished business to discuss. Herr Miller. She replied in the same language, recognizing the significance of his linguistic choice. This would be settled according to German traditions rather than American frontier customs. I've been expecting you. 17 years ago, your husband cost me everything I had built in Colorado. His self-righteous engineering reports destroyed my operations and drove me to rebuild in this wilderness. Muller's voice carried the weight of long-nursed grievance. I came to Wyoming territory planning to repay that debt through legal and economic means. And when legal means proved insufficient, you resorted to murder, environmental destruction, and mass poisoning of territorial water supplies. I resorted to necessary measures to protect legitimate business interests from interference by those who lacked proper understanding of industrial development. The euphemisms were telling. Even now, facing the complete collapse of his Wyoming empire, Mueller couldn't acknowledge the criminal nature of his activities. In his mind, he remained a legitimate businessman, victimized by regulatory interference and environmental extremism. Your husband destroyed my Colorado operations through legal technicalities and bureaucratic harassment. Mueller continued. You have destroyed my Wyoming ventures through sabotage and terrorist activities. The parallel is instructive. The parallel is that you've spent 15 years attempting to complete a criminal enterprise that Anton stopped through proper legal channels. I've simply used more direct methods to achieve the same result. More direct methods. Mueller smiled with bitter amusement. An interesting description for industrial sabotage and destruction of private property worth millions of dollars. Property acquired through systematic poisoning of public water supplies and murder of anyone who threatened to expose your activities. Elise's German temper was rising, but she maintained the formal courtesy that tradition demanded. You forfeited any claim to civilized treatment when you chose criminal means to pursue your business objectives. Mueller nodded, acknowledging the validity of her position even as he rejected its implications for his own conduct. Perhaps. But the immediate question is how to resolve our current disagreement in a manner suitable to our common heritage. He opened the case containing his father's dueling pistols, revealing weapons of obvious quality and careful maintenance. The pistols were perfectly matched, identical weight, barrel length, and mechanical action. Traditional German honor demanded equality of weapons in formal combat. I propose we settle this according to the old customs, Mueller said. Single combat with equal weapons conducted according to proper protocol. Winner takes possession of the disputed territory and the right to pursue their chosen objectives without further interference. The challenge was formally correct, but practically absurd. Elise had no intention of risking her life in a duel when she'd already achieved victory through superior tactics and engineering. Muller's empire was destroyed. Territorial authorities were investigating his crimes. Federal officials were en route to seize his remaining assets. But she also understood the psychological necessity behind his challenge. Muller needed to believe that his defeat resulted from superior force rather than superior intelligence, that he'd lost to a better warrior rather than a better engineer. German pride demanded combat narrative rather than acknowledgement of tactical incompetence. I decline your challenge, Herr Muller. Our conflict has already been resolved through methods more appropriate to territorial law and frontier justice. Then you forfeit any claim to honorable victory. Muller's voice hardened with contempt. You hide behind sabotage and legal technicalities rather than facing your enemy in honest combat. I defend my homestead and territorial water supplies through whatever means prove most effective against criminal aggression. Honor is irrelevant when facing enemies who've abandoned civilized conduct. The philosophical difference was fundamental and irreconcilable. Muller viewed their conflict as a matter of personal honor between German equals to be settled through traditional combat. Elise saw it as frontier warfare against environmental criminals to be won through superior tactics regardless of formal protocols. Very well, Muller said, closing the pistol case with careful precision. If you won't face me honorably, you'll face me as I choose to fight. He drew a modern revolver from beneath his coat, a Colt .45, that represented American industrial efficiency rather than German martial tradition. The gesture symbolically abandoned any pretense of civilized conflict in favor of simple frontier violence. But Elise had been expecting treachery since the moment Muller arrived. The Spencer rifle was already rising to her shoulder as his revolver cleared leather, and her first shot took him in the chest before he could aim properly. Mueller staggered, looking down at the spreading bloodstain with surprise rather than pain. German engineering had failed him for the second time, in 15 years this time, in the form of superior weapons and tactics, applied by a widow who'd learned frontier survival through bitter necessity. "Es ist vorbei," Elise said quietly, keeping the rifle trained on him as he fell. "It's over." Henrik Mueller died in the October snow beside Bitter Creek, his blood mixing with the clean water he'd spent 2 years trying to poison. His death marked the end of a conflict that had spanned 2 territories and 15 years, finally resolved through the same engineering precision that had started it. As Elise watched the life fade from Miller's eyes, she felt no satisfaction, only the weary relief of someone who'd completed a necessary but distasteful task. The man who'd threatened her homestead and planned mass murder was dead, but his death solved nothing beyond the immediate tactical problem of personal survival. The real victory lay in the destruction of his environmental crimes and the protection of territorial water supplies for future generations. Muller's death was simply the final detail in a larger engineering project, the systematic elimination of industrial threats to Wyoming Territory's natural resources. When Tokala arrived an hour later, drawn by the gunshot, he found Elise sitting on her porch with the rifle still across her knees, staring at Muller's body with the expression of someone calculating complex problems. "It's finished," he asked. "The immediate threat is eliminated, but the broader problems remain: contaminated mine sites, poisoned water, damaged land that will take decades to recover." She gestured toward the valley where Muller's operations had scarred the landscape. "Stopping the criminals is only the first step. Repairing the damage they've caused will require sustained effort from territorial and federal authorities. As they discussed what to do with Muller's body and his remaining assets, Elise reflected on how completely her life had changed since Anton's death. She'd started as a grieving widow, trying to maintain a homestead through legal means. She'd become a frontier engineer, applying technical expertise to problems of environmental protection and tactical warfare. The transformation was complete and irreversible. Wyoming Territory had forged her into something new, a guardian of natural resources, who understood both legal advocacy and practical violence. Muller's death marked not the end of her story, but the beginning of her real work in territorial conservation. From the Laramie Sentinel, November 15, 1882. Special Master's Report exposes mining conspiracy. Federal investigation documents. Systematic environmental crimes. The territorial investigation into consolidated mining syndicate operations has concluded with damning findings that expose systematic environmental destruction and criminal conspiracy spanning 2 years of illegal activity in Wyoming Territory. Special Master William Thornton, appointed by Circuit Judge Nathaniel Blackwood to investigate allegations of water contamination and mining fraud, submitted his final report documenting environmental crimes of unprecedented scale and sophistication designed to maximize short-term profits through systematic destruction of territorial natural resources. The investigation revealed that Henrik Mueller, principal owner of Consolidated Mining through various corporate intermediaries, operated secret mining facilities that deliberately contaminated water supplies across thousands of square miles. Evidence collected by territorial authorities includes photographic documentation of illegal waste disposal directly into navigable waterways, chemical analysis proving dangerous contamination levels in streams flowing to major river systems, testimony from affected parties documenting illness and livestock deaths caused by poisoned water, corporate records showing deliberate concealment of environmental damage from territorial officials. Muller's operations violated every principle of responsible mining and environmental stewardship, Special Master Thornton wrote in his report. The evidence suggests a deliberate pattern of criminal activity designed to externalize environmental costs while maximizing private profits through systematic violation of riparian water law and public nuisance doctrine. The investigation also documented Muller's use of violence against citizens who attempted to expose his activities. Mrs. Elise Hoffman, whose homestead controlled key water rights in the affected drainage, survived multiple assassination attempts before fatally shooting Mueller in self-defense during his final assault on her property. Mrs. Hoffman's courage in gathering evidence and defending territorial water resources deserves recognition from every citizen who values clean water and environmental protection. Judge Blackwood stated, her actions prevented environmental disaster on a scale that could have affected water supplies for decades. U.S. Marshal protection had been provided in guarded quarters for witnesses during the investigation, but proved unnecessary after Muller's death eliminated the primary source of violent intimidation. Federal authorities have seized Mueller's remaining assets to compensate victims of water contamination and fund environmental restoration efforts. The secret valley mining operation discovered through Mrs. Hoffman's investigation has been permanently closed and will be monitored for long-term environmental remediation. Territorial officials praised the investigation as a model for protecting natural resources from industrial exploitation. This case demonstrates that Wyoming Territory will not tolerate environmental destruction disguised as legitimate business activity. Territorial Governor William Hale announced, "We have both the legal authority and the political will to prosecute environmental crimes regardless of the perpetrator's wealth or political connections." The Hoffman homestead, which controlled the choke point where Mueller planned to hide his environmental crimes, has been designated a territorial landmark, recognizing Mrs. Hoffman's contribution to environmental protection and water conservation. Mrs. Hoffman continues to operate her homestead along Bitter Creek, where clean water now flows freely toward downstream communities. She has established a technical consulting service to help territorial officials investigate mining practices and ensure compliance with water protection laws. Environmental protection requires both legal advocacy and technical expertise, Mrs. Hoffman stated. Anton always believed that engineering should serve the public interest rather than private profit. I intend to continue his work protecting Wyoming Territory's natural resources for future generations. Tokala Whispering Fox, the Lakota warrior, who assisted Mrs. Hoffman's investigation, has been appointed as a territorial liaison for monitoring water quality on reservation lands. His knowledge of traditional ecological practices and willingness to work with territorial authorities has been praised as a model for cooperation between different communities sharing common water resources. The investigation's findings have prompted territorial legislation requiring comprehensive environmental review of all new mining operations, mandatory water quality monitoring, and substantial financial bonding to ensure proper cleanup of mining sites. Federal officials indicated that the Wyoming investigation will serve as a model for environmental enforcement in other territories, where mining interests have prioritized profits over public health and natural resource protection. The Mueller case demonstrates that environmental crimes carry serious consequences. Stated federal prosecutor James Wellington, "We have the legal tools and political support necessary to prosecute industrial activities that threaten public water supplies regardless of the political or economic influence of the perpetrators." As winter snow blankets the Medicine Bow Mountains, clean water flows past the Hoffman homestead toward communities downstream that depend on Bitter Creek for drinking water, irrigation, and livestock. The water runs clear and cold, carrying the promise of environmental recovery and sustainable resource management. Mrs. Hoffman's victory over industrial crime has established important precedents for territorial environmental law and demonstrated the effectiveness of combining legal advocacy with technical expertise and, when necessary, frontier justice applied with German engineering precision. The broader implications extend beyond Wyoming Territory to questions of federal authority over mining safety, water rights, and sanitary reports that affect multiple states and territories. Legal scholars predict that the precedents established in Territory versus Consolidated Mining Syndicate will influence environmental law for decades to come. For now, the immediate threat has been eliminated and the criminals have been brought to justice, and clean water flows freely through valleys that were nearly poisoned permanently by industrial greed and environmental recklessness.